Hi, hello. I'm Bobby Ann. I'm your community manager and host for the day. I am actually joined by Grace Hassler today. And the reason why we wanted to have Grace on as our first interview of Paddle Her Way is because Grace has a very cool job. She is a spokesperson for the National Park Service. Grace, thank you so much for taking time to join us and sharing your advice today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on your show.
Awesome. I cannot tell you how much I've been looking forward to this conversation because the National Park Service is such a treasured asset to the Girl Paddlers community. So I'm ready to dive in. What do you do and where are you at?
So, I am a spokesperson for the National Park Service. I am located in Washington, D.C., in our national headquarters. I help a lot with all sorts of national communications across the National Park Service. I always love getting to talk about paddling, though. In my personal life, I am a paddler and am always happy to share the good word and get information about, how to paddle safely, where to paddle, all of those good things.
Well, let's dive into that then. You have a very cool job. I'm sure that's given you the opportunity to see many of the parks that we have here in the US. So, what are some of the types of paddling opportunities that are available in our national parks that some people might not know about?
Yeah, so if you can imagine a paddling activity, it's probably available in a national park somewhere. It's really amazing. There are opportunities to paddle in our urban parks, in remote parks, small parks, big parks. There are opportunities for all kinds of skill levels and kinds of paddlecraft. Everything from you can take sculling classes here in the Potomac River. You can rent sups out near the tidal basin, which is part of the National Mall. You can do a leisurely canoe tour through the Everglades. You could do a multi-day whitewater rafting trip through the Grand Canyon, sea kayaking off the coast of Glacier Bay up in Alaska, and really everything in between. There's so many amazing opportunities out there to get paddling in our national parks.
Wow. So basically, any type of paddling you can think of, you can find a national park that's offering that.
Probably, over 100 national parks offer some sort of opportunity for paddling. Many parks have places that you can actually rent boats and equipment and offer guided tours and trips. And if you need some inspiration, you can actually search for parks that offer paddling opportunities by visiting our website. You can go to nps.gov/find a park and select paddling in the activity category, and it'll filter all of the parks that offer some sort of paddling activity.
So that makes it very easy to find. And, it
Yeah.
sounds like with all of the different options, you can probably find different types of paddling in different environments. So you're getting different experiences as you're exploring the different parks.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's everything, from our tropical parks to our Arctic parks. There are places to paddle as long as you have the skills to do that safely there.
Great. Well, we're definitely going to get into talking about safety a little bit later in the conversation. But for now, you've mentioned a lot of cool parks and a lot of cool ways that we can do paddling in our parks. What are some of your favorite ones that you've been able to visit?
Oh gosh, I have been paddling in a lot of parks. I am super fortunate to live very close to the C&O Canal National Historic Park, which is actually right along the Potomac River, all the way from Cumberland, Maryland, down to Georgetown, D.C. And there are paddling opportunities from, beautiful, just flat water floats all the way through class 5 rapids on the river. So I'm actually out on the C&O Canal and on the Potomac River almost every week, if not multiple times a week. So that's a great park that I love to paddle in. I was actually just out there yesterday evening. It was wonderful. Some other really great parks that I have paddled in are this past summer, I took an amazing pack rafting trip through Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park.
Oh,
We
man.
hiked down into the canyon and then pack rafted out. That was amazing and probably something I've never seen before. Trying to think of some other great places I've paddled. I have rafted the Grand Canyon. That was really excellent. I've done some more relaxed paddling. I've done some stand-up paddleboarding up in Glacier National Park. I've done some paddleboarding up in Olympic National Park. There are just so many opportunities out there, and I am excited to find even more parks to paddle in moving forward.
That sounds so incredible. I mean, every experience has to be so different. And so I'm curious, how was the packing paddle? Like, I've never done anything that extensive, and I know that's something that is a conversation every season in our community is whether people want to try that out or not, because it is a different skill set from just your typical like weekend paddle at the lake.
Absolutely. So it definitely took a ton of preparation and a ton of ensuring that me and my partner, who I went pack rafting with, had the skills and the equipment and everything else we needed to make sure that we were going to have a safe and enjoyable time. It was one of the most challenging things I've ever done. But it was probably one of the most unique things I've ever done too. There are some amazing opportunities at Black Canyon of the Gunnison, both up on the rim as well as down in the canyon. It is not for the faint of heart. I really want to emphasize that. You know, the Black Canyon of the Gunnison talks a lot about how the routes that you take to get down into the canyon, which is a wilderness area, they're not trails. They are routes. They require route finding. They require a lot of confidence in your, ability to hike and your ability to keep yourself safe. And but once we got down there, which was really challenging, and I really want to emphasize, making sure that you're prepared before you take that trip. Something the Grand Canyon likes to say is down is optional, up is mandatory. In our case, fortunately, up was not mandatory so long as everything went right when we went down. But it was nothing like I've seen before. We were down there apparently in the 3-day window where these insects called salmon flies emerge. So it was us and then a few other people who were down there for fishing, and like 3 million salmon flies, and they would just fly and they would land on you, and they're very large. They're like 2 or 3 inches long. And it was really, truly one of the most unique experiences and incredible experiences I've ever had. Pack rafting is really awesome. It's the only way that we were going to be able to do that. You can't really lug a 45-pound kayak down, the side of a canyon. I guess maybe some people can. I am not one of those people. So that was a really interesting and exciting part of that trip, right? I mean, I had my pack raft on my back. I had all my camping gear on my back. I had all of my paddling gear on my back beyond just a pack raft. There was so much going on. But that's just, one of so many different experiences that you can have. And probably, there are so many more easily accessible experiences that are equally amazing. When I went stand-up paddleboarding in Glacier, they had a rental concessionaire there where I just rented a paddleboard. They gave me a life jacket, and there was a lake, and I just had to carry, the paddleboard a few feet to the lake, and still had one of the best views I've ever seen in my life, which is the wonderful part about national parks is, there's opportunities and challenges for any level of skill, any level of interest, right? I can't.
Yeah, just I know
Any level
so
of
many
interest.
Yeah, so many good things to praise about our parks for sure. And I have to say, I've never heard of a salmon fly, so I'm gonna have to look that up and throw a picture of that up on our video here because I'm curious to see what that is. That sounds massive for a bug. Terrifying to be in the midst of thousands of them, or when
Yeah.
it's their time of year. How lucky or unlucky for you guys that you landed during all of that.
I found it very lucky. It was just it was us and these people, these fly fishers who clearly are tracking, the bugs because,
Yeah.
when certain things emerge, certain insects emerge, then all the fish come out. The fish were super happy that the salmon flies are out. And honestly, I didn't mind it. They'd land on you and you just kind of be like, oh, hey, friend. Sometimes I'd have my helmet on and something would like crawl down in front of my eye. And I'd be like, oh, okay, well, we're going to move you somewhere else. But it was really unique. Can I add one thing in for the Black Canyon part
Please.
too? So something that was important that we did before we went out on that trip was we got a permit from the Black Canyon of the Gunnison Visitor Center. And we also attended a safety briefing and kind of a a presentation by a ranger so that they could also, emphasize the importance of being prepared for that trip.
Okay. So actually, let's deep dive into that a little bit more. So all of these
Sure.
different types of experiences that we can go on, whether it's the Grand Canyon, you're going rafting somewhere, you're going kayaking on a river, or just going up to glacier. What are some things that we do need to be conscious of like that when we're preparing for a trip in a national park?
So rules and regulations are going to vary from park to park and in some cases state to state, which I'll mention in a bit. It's essential to always check the park specific information before heading out on a trip. The park's website is a great place to start for that information. If you have any outstanding questions, you can always then reach out to the park if you need to, or speak to a ranger once you're there for more info. Although a lot of times we want some of this information before we arrive at the park. All of your typical rules are really going to apply when you're visiting a national park and paddling in a national park, right? Like we leave what we find, we respect wildlife. But in terms of paddling specific rules, there are some universal rules across parks that visitors should think about. One of the big ones, you might be able to guess, Bobby Ann, do you know what I might be about to say in terms of things that you have to do if you're paddling in a park?
Oh, I'm going to say PFD.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
You always have to be wearing a PFD, a life jacket. It has to be in good condition. It needs to fit the paddler. It needs to be securely fastened. And these are things that a lot of paddlers, I think, know, but it's important to reiterate. And it also should be Coast Guard approved, right? That PFD isn't going to do much for us unless it's in good working condition and fits us and we're wearing it. If we have it on our paddleboard and we fall in, it's going to be a lot harder to get that PFD on than if we were just wearing it in the first place.
How do we know if a PFD is Coast Guard approved?
You can find the label generally on the inside or back of that PFD. It's going to have this big label. They might have changed it in the past couple of years, but somewhere on that PFD, it should say U.S. Coast Guard on there. And
Perfect.
You should double check it.
Very good to know.
Yeah. And as a reminder, you should check with the manufacturer to make sure that your PFD has not passed its retirement age. PFDs only are considered, usable within a certain amount of time after they have been manufactured. So that's a great thing to check before you head out because that buoyancy can reduce if you have had that PFD for too long.
Hi girls, jumping in for just a moment because I received a message from Grace after recording with a quick correction. Unlike other safety gear, PFDs specifically don't have a mandatory retirement age. Instead, the U.S. Coast Guard recommends that PFDs be inspected for wear and tear and buoyancy at least once a year. So if your PFD is waterlogged, faded, damaged, think rips, tears, frayed straps, broken buckles, things of that nature, they should be discarded and replaced. So once a year, check for wear and tear and buoyancy. Okay, that's it. Thanks, Grace. Back to the conversation. Oh, that's actually something I didn't know. And that's something I should certainly pass along to my friends. I actually live in an area that is surrounded by a lake and a river. So a lot of my friends are boating all summer long, and I can guarantee you that some of those life jackets have been on the boats for decades. So that's something I had no clue that you needed to get a refresher or they like outdated.
Yeah. It's definitely something to look into and check again with that manufacturer to see what their recommended retirement date is and definitely refresh if they're a few decades old.
Very, very good to note. I will be passing that along. Hope you guys heard that too, because I'm sure I'm not the only one that didn't know that. All right. So outside of PFDs, what are some other things we need to consider?
Absolutely. So another one that's pretty straightforward is you should only be paddling in places where paddling is allowed. So again, that goes back to checking and making sure that you know what the rules are. You should not use or be under the influence of drugs or alcohol while paddling. And last but not least, your paddlecraft, whatever boat you are in or craft you are in, should be in good working order so that it can keep you nice and safe while you're out there.
So I think those are pretty pretty standard universal things to keep in mind, even if you're not on a national park while you're paddling. Water safety, very important. We want you guys to have fun and enjoy the environment you're in, but we want you to be safe while you're doing it. So make sure you've got a nice PFD available, that you're wearing it. Don't be under the influence of anything that's not going to have your senses not up to par, and making sure that your vessel is checked out before you actually get on the water. So I love that. Those are easy things to remember, I think.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I have one more section to add that you're welcome to keep in or
Yeah.
out. That's kind of about park specific stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So let's jump
Yeah.
into park specifics outside of the general rules for all of them.
Cool. Yeah. So again, it's best to check in with the park for any specific information to ensure you're fully informed on what you need, right? Some parks do require entrance fees to get in, even beyond paddling. Be prepared for that. Some parks do require a permit to launch a vessel. And some parks will have additional regulations because of the park itself or because of the state that they're in. So for example, in Grand Teton National Park, if you're planning to bring like a kayak or a canoe into the park or even into the state of Wyoming, you're going to need a permit from the national park, from Grand Teton. You also need to have that boat inspected on your way into the park. And you're going to need to grab an aquatic invasive species decal from the state of Wyoming, and they're possibly going to need to inspect your boat as well. All of this information is on Grand Teton's website, but that's an example where you really want to be on that website because of how specific the information is for Grand Teton versus maybe a different park that doesn't have as many regulations.
Okay, so noted. We definitely need to be doing plenty of research before we
Yeah.
just decide that we're going to pop in and try to paddle in a national park, because it's going to be very specific to the location you're going to. So that's really good to know. And I mean, these assets are very all of this information is very easy to find. It's all going to be on the national park websites, and each individual park also has its own portal. So if you know where you're going, you can just go directly to that individual park's portal as well.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
Awesome. Really great information. Because I know that, especially, we've had a lot of conversation happening in the community about people wanting to visit some of the national parks for the first time this summer. So we've
I
kind of
love
talked
that.
about in our introduction episode that this is the first full blown paddle season of the Girl Paddlers community. So a lot of people are starting their adventures for the first time or exploring new areas for the first time. So I'm glad we're giving plenty of attention to the water safety and preparation portion. So you had mentioned you're an avid paddler yourself, but you're not just a paddler for your own enjoyment, but you are also a certified river, kayak, and canoe guide. You're a wilderness first responder and trained in swiftwater rescue. That's quite the resume.
I
So
like to be prepared.
well, it sounds like you're more than prepared, and I would feel so confident being on a paddle journey with you. So I'm sure with all of that and as much time you've spent on the water, there are some crazy things that you have come across and seen, and you see time and time again. So what are the most common mistakes and risks that you see paddlers making that we can
So,
avoid?
so that's a tough question. And I really think it depends on where and when we're talking about. But in general, I just mentioned this, I really like to be prepared. And the most common mistakes that people make come from unpreparedness. And that's why it's so important for visitors to remember that you are primarily responsible for your safety while visiting national parks. And there are a lot of things that we can do to be prepared to minimize the likelihood of those mistakes happening. There's lots of tips and tricks that I'm happy to share. We also have some great, again, opportunities on our website to read about in terms of trip planning guides, as well as water safety on the website. So even if you don't want to keep listening back to this podcast on, ways to stay safe on the water, you can find all of this information online as well. In a nutshell, it's really important for anyone who is visiting a national park to learn about the park's environment, to pick the right activity for your skill and experience level and the skill and experience level of anybody that you are recreating with, and then to pack the right gear and equipment for your activity.
So, how can being in a different type of environment really affect the experience and how much you need to prepare?
So, being in a different environment really will change that experience completely, right? If you're used to paddling on a beautiful, calm lake in the middle of summer where it's very warm, that's going to be one experience. That might be different than paddling on a lake in the summer in a different area of the country where that lake is fed by glaciers or snowmelt, right? All of a sudden, that water, even if it's July and even if it feels beautiful outside, could be freezing cold. And that is the kind of thing that we really want people to be aware of, that just because they've paddled in one place doesn't mean that they've paddled in another place. I have my 4 W's of paddling that I like to talk about when preparing for conditions. I'm happy to share those.
Yeah, what are the four
All right.
W's? I've never heard this before.
Yeah. Do you want to take a guess of different conditions that we want to think of that start with W when we are getting ready for a paddling trip?
Well, we just did an episode talking about choosing like choosing whether to do a paddleboard or a boat. One of them was weight.
Oh,
Is
I like
that
that one.
is
This is not one of my W's, but that's
okay?
certainly something to consider in terms of picking the right paddle craft for you.
Okay,
Um,
so maybe I'm gonna say water type then.
Absolutely. So water is one of those 4 W's, and there's a lot that goes into that. So one of the ones I just talked about was water temperature, right? Especially as we are coming into the spring season, which is when a lot of people start paddling again. The water temperature is starting to warm up, but it certainly does not warm up as quickly as the air does. You know, it's something I like to tell people is just because we get one special 80-degree day in March doesn't mean that the water got the memo. In some areas of the country, the water is going to stay cold year round, and it's going to stay very cold year round depending on where it's sourced from. You know, so like I mentioned, in Glacier, a lot of that water comes from snowmelt and potentially glaciers. And so it's going to be very cold even in July and August.
Oh yeah, those of us who are living closer to the East Coast, you're over in Washington, so
Yes.
you're getting to enjoy warm East Coast waters. West Coast, not having that experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of paddling seasons, especially with rivers, right? That water is fed by snowmelt, and that's when the water comes, and it's going to be cold. In
Yeah, that's
terms of,
not for me.
yeah. Some other parts about water that we want to think about are the water level, right? For moving waterways like rivers and streams, do you know what the normal water level is? Is the river or stream currently flooding? Is it much lower than it normally is? You know, water features can change significantly depending on that water level. In addition to just water level, we're thinking about how is that water moving, right? Currents, whether that's a river current, whether that's a tidal current. How fast is that current moving? For tides, do you know what that tide cycle is? Is the tide coming in or out when you're paddling? Are you going to have to be paddling against the tide on your way back? It's a lot easier to paddle with the current than against it. So we always want to make sure that we're able to paddle against that current in the event that we need to come back if needed.
We actually just had a really great example of this posted in our community group this week because last year we did a paddling retreat to Burgess Falls in East Tennessee, and we had a drought last summer, and so the water levels were very low. And someone just went this past weekend. We're currently, as recording this, we're in April, and it looked like a completely different area. I mean, I could not believe how the environment looked. It didn't even look like the same location. So if you guys are looking at pictures on a website or on social media and you're like, yeah, that's exactly when I want to go experience, the time of year can make a huge difference in what the water levels are.
Absolutely. And with that, you know, changing water levels, changing currents comes different water hazards, some of which might be constants in the river, some of which might change depending on the time of year or even just the weather events that have happened previously, right? So it's important to learn about the likely hazards that you might encounter on your paddling trip, right? If you're on a river or stream, are there rapids, right? Even if there aren't rapids, are there hazards such as strainers or swift currents, potential foot entrapments that you could encounter even on any kind of moving water, even if there's no rapid on it. Is there anything that you will have to portage also, if you have to carry around it as you're going down the river, right? Is there a dam? You need to know about that. You need to ask somebody or read a map or talk with a park ranger. And within that, has there been any sort of high water event, low water event that might have deposited new hazards into the river, right? Talk to the ranger, ask them, when was the last time somebody paddled where I'm about to paddle? Have there been any new hazards since the last time anybody has gone down there, right? For lakes and such, the answer might be somebody was just out there yesterday. Everything's looking good still, right? For other places that don't get paddled as frequently, you might need to be a little bit more alert. They could say, we've had a lot of high water events the past few weeks. Nobody's been out since that happened. And we're not sure what kind of new wood might be in that river, for example. And then it's also just nice to check in about some other potential hazards that you might not even think about, right? Are there toxic algal blooms happening on a lake right now, right? At some of our seashores, have there been sightings of certain wildlife that we might not want to be in the water with, right? And keep all of those in mind as we move forward. So the water W is definitely the longest one. There are 3 more, but they go a little bit faster.
Yeah, well,
It's
let's
certainly
hear it.
the most robust. Yeah. So the next W to think about is weather, right? So you should be looking at the current weather, but also the forecast. You need to check that forecast before you launch. Just because it's a beautiful blue sky day as you're putting on doesn't mean that it's not predicting 100% chance of thunderstorms in an hour from now. And you have the clothing and gear needed to stay safe in whatever the predicted weather is, whether that's a beautiful sunny day, whether that is chilly and rainy. Should you still paddle depending on the weather forecast? Are you prepared, or is it just an unsafe condition to be paddling in regardless of what equipment you have, right? And what is your plan if you encounter severe weather? Those are all things to consider when it comes to weather, air temperature, all of that. And then we have wind, which is kind of a part of weather, but we keep it a little bit separate. Wind obviously can make it really difficult to paddle, particularly if you need to paddle into the wind, especially when you need to paddle into the wind to get back to shore. That's something really important to think about. It's a lot easier to paddle with the wind than it is against it. I was just paddling in some pretty strong winds last night, and I can tell you it makes a huge difference. I was very tired paddling into the wind. It also makes our 4th W, which is waves. And waves are really important to think about because they can happen in many different places. They're not just happening in the ocean. They can happen in lakes. They can happen in the Great Lakes. On some whitewater rivers, we get some waves. It's important to think about, have you paddled in waves before? Have you paddled in the size of waves that you might be going out into now? Are they larger than they normally are for this area? What other experience do you have paddling in these conditions? All important things for you to talk about and think about before you pick a paddling excursion.
Yeah, I mean, wind and waves too. You have to consider that if you've planned your day for a certain amount of hours, you think you're only going to go out for an hour or two. And, when you're talking about energy reserves and how exhausted you are coming back in, if you haven't planned for that weather forecast and you're fighting against larger waves than you thought, you're fighting against more wind than you thought you were going to, exhaustion plays a big part in safety because a lot of times that's where drowning happens. That's where you might get off course a little bit because you can't really take the course you were planning on because the wind and waves take you a different way and you just can't get back to that safer path. So I think that those are all incredible tips to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And that's why we always emphasize picking the right activity for your skill and experience level. And understanding those conditions in advance really helps you to be able to do that.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, even if it's even if the area fits your skill level, if all of those different conditions are changing, if that skill level matches you on a nice sunny day where there's no wind or extra waves, um, you know, that doesn't mean it's going to fit on a day right after a storm where things might be a little different. So, very great points there. I think that's super helpful. I hope that people are taking notes on the other end while they're listening. But of course, we'll have all this information easy for you to find. And I think this is such an important topic. And this is, again, exactly why we wanted to have you on as like our very first interview, because these are incredible tips that people can take all through paddle season, but really any time of year. So it's very evergreen information that never gets outdated. Safety is always top of mind when we're talking about paddling, and we preach on this all season long. So thank you so much for sharing all of that knowledge, and we'll keep in mind the 4Ws for the rest of the season. It's always been important for us to focus on protecting the environment, and I think that the time we're living in right now is a very pivotal moment in focusing on conservation. So it would be remiss of me to not touch on environmental impacts during this conversation. So what are the biggest environmental impacts that our parks are facing at the moment when it comes to waterways and aquatic ecosystems?
So we have three that really come to top of mind when we talk about challenges and threats that are facing our aquatic ecosystems and waterways. The first is changes in water levels, which we talked a little bit about previously, but we're starting to see that river floods are becoming larger and more frequent than they used to be in some places, and are becoming smaller and much less frequent in other places due to drought. And so in places that are becoming much more vulnerable to high intensity floods, paddlers should really be concerned about human safety during those flash flood events or high water events, as well as flood events restructuring the flow of a river or the flow of rapids and changing the river in ways that we may not understand. For places that are becoming a lot more vulnerable to drought, paddlers should really be focused on the flow dropping so low that certain areas become impassable by boat. Again, that the nature of that river or wherever you're paddling has changed. We talked about earlier in your visit earlier this year, you said it almost looked like a completely different place. So water levels are something we are definitely keeping an eye on. The second concern that we have is for water quality. Excessive nutrient and pollutant input from human activities are really changing the water's ability to support species and biodiversity in those waterways, along with changes in water temperature, water quantity, and, again, general water quality. And they can support and cause again, loss in biodiversity, and also things like harmful algal blooms, which I mentioned a little bit ago, which can not only be detrimental to the species that live in and around the waterway, but they can also be detrimental to recreationists and people and things like their pets. So it's really important to be mindful of water quality warnings when visiting waterways, whether that's in national parks or elsewhere. And then the last one I want to talk about, which I think a lot of paddlers might be fairly familiar with, is invasive species. So if a species is introduced to a new river or a new waterway of any kind, and that species depletes native populations of fish and other wildlife, those invasive species can really disrupt the ecosystem. This is really important for paddlers to consider because the presence of invasive species in a waterway really requires our extra care and precaution, because our paddle crafts, if we take them from one body of water to another, can be transporters of invasive species. So it's really important that if you are taking your boat of any kind from one waterway to another body of water, that they should be cleaned after every use using standard clean, drain, dry, dispose protocols.
And that can actually be in reference to equipment as well. So I love snorkeling and diving, and that's something that I actually learned during my diving course was like even your shoes. Like if you have diving shoes or paddling shoes, the grooves in the bottom of your shoes can pick things up like coral and rocks that have things on them, and they may look clean, you may not even know because the pores rivers are so small, and you can introduce that into an environment that can't sustain that. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, not just your boat, but all of your equipment. Give it a good rinse, or even if you have like separate equipment for saltwater and freshwater. It's a it's a lot easier to prevent than it is to correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to really think about there. Um, and gosh, selfishly, I could really go on about this section of it, the environmental impact section of it, for hours and hours. But you have an important job. I know you can't spend that much time nerding out with me on this one. But what are some things that we can do to help support the environments that we're visiting, and just support our parks as a whole?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So we've talked about a few of them throughout this, right? We just talked about how we can manage and help eliminate the spread of invasive species. That's a huge one. Some other ways that we can support national parks right now is making sure that we are coming prepared and with understanding of what those rules and regulations are when visiting, and ensuring that we are following those rules and helping everybody that we are visiting with follow those rules, whether that's paddling, whether that's just walking around. We should always be trying to follow the leave no trace principles when we visit national parks. The more that we can share information about those national parks and about what we've learned to anybody else who might be choosing to go visit a national park, the better their visitor experience will also be.
And where
We
can we
can
find a lot of that information outside of the website?
You can check out our social media pages. You might have heard of our Instagram or seen our Facebook.
Big kudos to the marketing team over there.
Yes, yes.
Love those guys.
And they do a great job of mixing in these wonderful messages about how to stay safe in parks and what we can do to keep ourselves safe, as well as the natural environment in our park safe, or historical objects, or, wherever you're visiting. So beyond just the national park website, we actually also have an app, and this app is amazing. It has all of the information that you could need generally about a park. You can also download a lot of the information about the park, including maps, from the app, so that you can have it downloaded onto your device when you go and visit parks. You might realize, or you might have noticed, that a lot of our national parks might not have as reliable cell phone service as you're used to having in your own home. So the app is a great place and a great resource to use when visiting national parks. And before you visit too, right? You can take a look at it and get all the information you need before heading out on your adventure.
Yeah, that's super helpful, because I think a lot of the purpose of going out into the national parks is being able to disconnect from all of our screens and enjoy nature. And, but of course you do need to know where you're going. So being able to download that ahead of time without having to like try to access internet when you're, 3 miles out into the woods or the river, that's good to know.
Definitely. It's a really great resource that we cannot emphasize enough is when it comes to your visit.
I actually didn't know that there was an app, so I'm sure I'm
Yeah.
not the only one. So thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, so like I said, I could go on and on and on and on and on. This is like, I've been looking forward to this conversation so much, and you have just been a hub of knowledge that I know all of our listeners are going to appreciate. So, as we close up here, I just have one last parting question. The show is called Paddle Her Way. So, I would love to know, what does it look like to paddle Grace's way? It could be how you paddle, where you paddle, what you paddle, anything in between. What does that look like for you?
I like this question a lot. I guess I will talk a little bit about, the things I think about when I'm going paddling somewhere, right? One is I'm doing it because it makes me happy and it brings me joy. Something else I like to think about is the uniqueness and the fortune that I have to be able to experience the beautiful places that I'm paddling in from a very unique vantage point. That is, the river, the lake, wherever I am. And so keeping a feeling of gratitude as I paddle for the beautiful places that I am so fortunate to paddle in. I am primarily a kayaker, so that's a good way to paddle Grace's way. But I also love all of the other kinds of paddle craft. So again, just going back to paddle with joy and paddle with gratitude.
An absolutely beautiful answer. I
And,
think we
and paddle safely.
key. Yes.
Yeah.
So we should all be paddling Grace's way with enjoyment and safety. What a beautiful answer. Thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation. I've appreciated each and every tip that you've brought to the table today. And of course, you'll be able to find all of this information in the show notes here. We'll link out to all the resources we've talked about. We'll write up some extra notes for you, and it'll be easy to find. Grace, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun.